Around this time, Arch Glacor had just come out, and I'd been practicing it a bunch on another account for the first few days. After reaching and passing Iceborn on my other account, part of me was interested in trying to be the first hardcore to get that title. I was a bit hesitant at first since there were a few deadly bugs with the boss at the time, with the main one being if the boss died during the arms mechanic, you would be locked in with the mechanic still active until you died. Since we're on our last life, it seemed pretty risky at first. This boss is also quite dangerous even without that bug, since you can't teleport out of the fight, and you also can't use death touch darts, meaning if you go in, you either win the fight or you die. Then, a few days after the boss's release, another player accomplished the Iceborn title on their hardcore. Even though we would no longer be the first, it did inspire me to give it a go myself the following day. The plan was to do our kills without the use of weapon poison to ensure the boss couldn't die during the arms mechanic. This would mean that our DPM overall would be lowered, but it was a sacrifice that had to be made at the time. So I grabbed my Noxbow and started pushing in rage. And after a few hours of effort and mild stress, we successfully completed Iceborn on our hardcore as the second person to do it. Autos, okay. Oh, I forgot we had autos still. This should be good right here. And after beams, we should just be done. We're gonna be done right now in beams. Snap. Done. We did it! Holy crap! That was so stressful! Holy moly! Wowie! On a side note, I was also later informed that supposedly the person who had done it first also streamed it, but was taking advantage of a bug where you could spam SGB specs without the cooldown. I don't know for sure if that's true or not, but that's what a few people have told me, so in reality, we may have actually been the first legitimate hardcore to complete Iceborn, which I think is pretty cool. Either way, being second is pretty awesome as well. Away from the big icy boy, I finished off a couple 99s with Prayer and Hunter. Then, while working away at some more AOD, we got our first drop and received a Praesul wand. I'd actually forgotten to record during the hour it happened, so I quickly threw on the camera after so I could show it off. I'm such an idiot. Holy
That's
shit.
Gonna be a great clip.
Yeah, if I was recording.
No, the clip explaining why you didn't get it.
Well, it was nice knowing that seismic, holy. This is a super cool drop to get from AOD since it gives us a tier 92 main hand magic weapon. I hadn't originally been building out our magic setup, but with a drop like this, I was thinking it might be time to start working on that. And in the aims of being able to say we've completed every group boss on our hardcore, we set off to complete our first Yakamaru. This boss can be pretty scary for a couple of reasons, but the main thing to be cautious of is the stun pool phase. Most people have probably heard about the meme of using stuns on the stun pool because it's something that can wipe the entire team very fast. Basically, during the stun pool phase, if too many stuns are used quickly on the boss, it will deal high amounts of damage to the whole team. A high enough amount of damage that sending one asphyxiate can potentially wipe an entire team. So my strategy during this phase is to just shield camp and rotate defensives just in case someone does an oopsie. As long as I have some kind of defensive up, the worst case scenario should be survivable. On a good note, this wasn't something I had to deal with and the kill went relatively smoothly. And with that done, we've now defeated every single group boss on our hardcore, which I'd say is a pretty cool achievement. While doing a bit of Kerapac one day, we got another nice addition to our magic setup and received some Kerapac's Wristwraps. These are best in slot magic gloves for anything that isn't poisonable and are a lot of fun to use. They basically turn your combustibility into a mini Greco if you use it after your Dragon Breath ability. I'd been continuing to grind out Arch Glacor here and there because I thought it would be really cool to finish off a tier 95 on the hardcore. It was going really well and we even got a frozen core and had a decent amount of Nihilus saved up. But then one day the unfortunate happened. It's not what I wanted. What the fuck? No! Really? Why didn't my surge work? Well, it's all over. Well, that's a hardcore, I suppose it is. And with that goes our final life and our hardcore status. While it was really sad to see this happen, it was something that was going to happen eventually. This death was a little bit unexpected since I'd been quite consistent at Arch Glacor, but it ended up being the result of a bad play along with a bit of bad luck. Normally when you get across the middle of the arena during the ice pillars, you surge across to the other side to dodge them. Due to a misplay as I was getting set up in the top right at the start of this mechanic, my surge was 2 ticks away from being off cooldown when I went across the middle, and I hadn't realized. On top of that, the middle pillar that spawns late, by random chance, spawned directly on top of me. So on top of not surging through, I ended up also having 2 pillars hitting me at once, which made very quick work of me. If that pillar had spawned anywhere else, I probably would have survived, but sadly, that just wasn't how it happened. While a little bit shocked at first to lose our hardcore status, I'd also had plans for what I'd be working on once the inevitable finally happened. My plan now was to get better at the game and use this opportunity to learn everything that I could. I knew that I'd want to make another hardcore eventually, so this was just time to start preparing for that one. First thing first, it was time for me to learn to play full manual. This was something I'd been wanting to do for a while, but felt it wasn't a good idea to try and learn while playing on a hardcore. Now that I don't have to worry about dying, we can make the switch and be as awful as we want while learning. I'd previously made sure to set up my keybinds in a way so they were ready for me to make the switch. I honestly think that was a fantastic decision. Since at this point I'd already gotten used to my new keybinds over the past few months, I only had to get used to casting my basic abilities instead of that and also learning new keybinds. This made the process so much smoother and is something I'd recommend to anyone wanting to make the switch as well. On top of full manual allowing you to engage with the game on a deeper level, I've also found it to be a lot more fun. Sure, it felt a bit weird and overwhelming to press so many things at first, but it honestly didn't take that long before it all started to click and felt natural. Now it feels weirder to turn Revolution on and not press any buttons while I'm AFKing something. After getting the hang of full manual, it was time to start learning some new things in PvM. One day while doing some rots with my friends, I decided to try soloing one side of the fight, and I was surprised at how easy it actually was. This gave me the idea to go and give full-on solo rots a try. This is the first time I'd done anything like this, and it was honestly a bit tough to get the hang of at first. But after a handful of tries, it started to come together, and this is now one of my favorite things to do in game. I describe solo rots as a kiting DPS race because a majority of what you're doing is just a bunch of kiting and DPS. Two things I've grown to love for some strange reason. Solo rots is definitely something I'd recommend if you've never given it a go because it's honestly just a ton of fun. Another thing I'd wanted to try and start learning was how to do various roles at each boss, and one of the first things I went and learned was basing at Vorago. When I'd first done Vorago on the hardcore, I had no idea what I was doing, but at this point, it's become one of my favorite bosses. I'd highly recommend trying out the different roles at Vorago if you haven't done so before, because they're really not that difficult with some practice, and they're just a lot of fun. Then I took the time to learn to base at Beastmaster, which was an interesting experience and has also taught me how much I despise basing at Beastmaster. For anyone who's done this before, you can probably understand this sentiment. This boss will very frequently turn off and reset your defensives and will smack you very hard without them on. You really need to either solo base with kiting or have a good backup base, or else you're going to be in for a very painful time. This is literally the only boss I would never base on a hardcore. Continuing with my love of learning new base roles, I expanded my skill set into basing Solak next. Basing here isn't too different from being a DPS, so it actually wasn't too tough to pick up. I've even since made a complete bossing guide for Solak that also covers basing that I'll link to you on screen. Over time, I'd eventually gotten enough resources to make my first Leng sword from Arch Glacor. In order to make these weapons, you do also need some Blackstone hearts, which you get from Elite Dungeon 3. I'd never done full ED3 runs before, so I figured this was a great time to learn. The dungeon itself isn't particularly difficult, and I personally didn't find Crassian Leviathan or Terraket too difficult to pick up. The Ambassador, on the other hand, is a whole other beast. In terms of difficulty, I would definitely rank Ambassador around some of the toughest bosses in the game. It took me a good few tries to get my first kills here, and a lot more tries to get consistent at this boss. It was all worth it though, because even though Ambi is quite tough, it's a very fun boss fight and among my favorites. The funny thing about starting up Ambi was that I originally was just learning so I could get my Blackstone hearts from my Leng swords. What I didn't anticipate was getting a crossbow piece at only 9 KC, and then another one at 11 KC only 2 kills later. So it started as a hunt for Blackstone hearts, now turned into a hunt for the final ECB piece. And the absolute spoonage only continued with me getting the pet at 41 KC, and then finally finishing the log by 61 KC. By the time I was getting the hang of this boss, we were just already done with it. But I enjoyed every bit of it. Eventually, the 4th front from the Elder God Wars arrived, and it was time to start learning a bit of Zek. We pretty quickly were able to get our first flawless run to unlock hard mode, and also finished off all of the new fancy capes. I still haven't done a ton of this boss, but I have enjoyed what I've done of it so far. Next on my list of new things to learn was basing at AOD. This is a bit of a weird one to base, but is honestly one of my favorite bosses to base since it's kind of unique. I've now based quite a lot of AOD and even plan to do so in the next hardcore as well. This is another boss that I've since made a full guide on that includes all of the roles, which I'll also link on screen now. Basing Yakamaru was another one I wanted to learn, and I had a lot of fun in the process. The thing I've enjoyed about basing Yakamaru is it's a boss where you actually get to do some full-on defensive rotations. If you're used to that sort of thing already, definitely give this a go sometime, and if you're not, maybe try picking up a shield and trying this out. Funnily enough, at this point, I've actually based Yakamaru far more than I've done any other role there, so it's always interesting when I end up doing something else there. Since Kerapac had come out, I hadn't really spent a lot of time learning hard mode solos there. As I'd started filling out my magic setup, I decided to start giving it a proper go. This is a very interesting fight, mainly for its final phase, because it turns into this DPS race as you're being bombarded with high amounts of damage. I found the process of learning this boss started with me mostly using a lot of defensives on P4 to mitigate the large amounts of damage coming in, while slowly developing a strategy that would work consistently for me. As I got better and better at the phase, I eventually needed to use less and less defensives to stay afloat. Eventually, this phase instead became a dish out high DPM to nuke the clones very quickly, while making clever use of devotion and time warp to spend the entire time pumping out damage and not have to sit on a shield at all. It's been a really satisfying journey learning this boss, and it is a great deal of fun. And finally, the last thing I still needed to learn was the big hentai monster himself, Telos. I didn't purposely leave this boss for last, but my god was it the right decision. I really was not prepared for how brutally difficult this boss is to learn compared to literally anything else in the game. His mechanics require a lot of very specific timings and positioning while also dishing out large amounts of damage, and they are very unforgiving if you mess up. Essentially, Telos expects no less than perfection from you. This made for a very interesting and frustrating experience learning this boss, since there really isn't anything else in the game that acts this way. Once you start to get the hang of him though, it almost becomes a paint by numbers, since you very much want to execute your kills almost exactly the same every time. My first goal with Telos was to push to Warden, and this took me almost a couple weeks of here and there going for it. Sadly, I seem to have lost the clip from when I got Warden, but it was a very satisfying thing to complete. After finishing Warden, to practice, my plan was to do a few 0 to 500% streaks until I was getting consistent, and then push to 999 after. For some reason, I moved on from Telos after completing my first 0 to 500 streak, and I haven't gone back yet, but it is still on my list of plans. Telos was an absolutely brutal, but also rewarding experience, and I would definitely rank him as the hardest boss to learn by a mile. And with that, I guess this is where we'll wrap up this series. It's always sad when things end, but I think we did an amazing job on this account and accomplished so many awesome things, and I honestly had an absolute blast the whole time. On a positive note, since I've always been so far behind with this series, I have since already started my next hardcore account, which I have very big plans for, and if you frequent my stream, you'll already know that it's accomplished some pretty impressive things already. Since this will be my last video in this series, make sure to be on the lookout for the first episode of the next one, and thank you all so much for watching. It's been a wonderful ride, and I hope to see you again in the next one.